Mental health, another subsidiary element stemming from this topic, has increased in focus and study over the last few decades. Taking care of your mental health has ostensibly become just as imperative as maintaining physical health. Indeed, this notion is certainly valid as your mental state can directly affect your physical well-being. For example, you're less likely to engage in activities you would usually enjoy if you're feeling sad. The point is that preserving a healthy state of mind is crucial if one wishes not only to be happy, but also to find contentment. Even so, when does focusing on mental health become an excuse? Phrased differently, has the growing discussion surrounding mental health and its widespread campaigns become a crutch, or an easy way out, in some cases? Evidently, most people, if not all, deal with anxiety and stress on a regular basis, and to varying extents. Yet, some people fail to cope, and it can lead to disastrous outcomes. This has led some to claim that they failed to perform because they were under too much stress, or they were too anxious, etc. Another explanation could be that their mental health was in rough shape, and they needed more time to recuperate. Mental health can be very fickle. One moment it's your best friend, and on other occasions it becomes your worst adversary. The shape of your mind can either make or break you, and this is irrespective of external circumstance. It must be acknowledged that people grapple with stressors differently, whereas others have elevated anxiety or a proclivity towards depression because of genetic factors. This discussion isn't a critique of people who have genuine mental health issues, but rather it's an exploration of how the focus on mental health can sometimes turn into a crutch for otherwise healthy individuals. When I reflect on moments in my life where I've stated that poor mental health caused me to fail or perform insufficiently, I can't help but realize that my attitude towards those mental states exacerbated the situation. Had I approached the situation differently by refusing to make excuses, then perhaps I would have emerged from those distressing periods sooner. Prior experience and reflection enable me to conclude that perhaps it's truly all inside the mind, at least for the majority of circumstances. How you perceive your mental health is just as imperative as the actual state it currently occupies, whether that's satisfied, anxious, or depressed. I'll begin with a story from my life, one that I hope will give further credence to this exploration. A few years ago, I was entering the second semester of my second year at university. It was the winter semester, and because it was winter, the weather was rainy and gray for most of January and February. Nothing particularly unusual because the climate is mild where I was. Receiving snow days or a prolonged period of sunshine during the winter was when there would be a deviance. Anyhow, the rain and gray skies don't particularly bother me, but for some reason during that period, it seemed to only exacerbate my negative mental state. The beginning of January proceeded well enough, but circumstances went downhill shortly afterwards. My family's financial situation hit a rough patch. Arguments concerning money between my parents occurred almost daily. In addition to that, my interpersonal relationships weren't going too well. Particularly, I was vainly pursuing someone who wasn't returning my feelings. To compound the situation further, physical pain from an undiagnosed injury was bothering me on a constant basis. All of these factors began to impact my schooling. I skipped classes, failed to hand in some assignments on time, and I even ended up failing one of my courses that semester. I also lacked the motivation to work out, which I was usually always up for regardless of circumstance. Time appeared to slow down during those days, almost as if the torture needed to be prolonged, I thought ruefully on occasion. I recall not wanting to get out of bed. On other days I desired to lie in bed all day. Meanwhile, on some days it got to the point where I wished that I hadn't woken up at all. Those days were rough because I truly felt dead inside and numb to everything. I was operating on autopilot because my body kept going even though my mind didn't want to. All I saw and felt was gray, and any smidgen of happiness appeared to have eluded me. Even so, my obligations persisted. I still had to go to work and school. I did so reluctantly, but even when I was feeling depressed, I realized that I couldn't stop. I had to keep going, no matter how painful the endeavor was. Eventually, by the grace of God, I emerged from the hole I dug for myself at the end of March. The only explanation I can think of is that Jesus carried me through that time, because I certainly lacked the strength to continue on my own. Following that detrimental season, circumstances began to improve. I stopped pursuing the unrequited love, began to block out most of the stress regarding finances, resumed working out, and reoriented my focus on school. In the years that have followed, I've become stronger, and I haven't fallen into a comparable depressive state like before. I typically avoid thinking about this period, but when I reflect on it, I realize that my perceptions exacerbated the situation. Sure, I was depressed, but I could have recovered sooner had I refused to utilize it as an excuse. I ultimately became my own worst enemy, and the negative feedback from my thoughts prolonged the suffering. My thinking became circular. I perceived that circumstances weren't proceeding to my liking, and therefore, I felt depressed because of it. My depression further elevated the pessimistic thoughts, which evidently fueled the perception that circumstances were worse than they appeared. Furthermore, the impact on my performance in school arose because of my depressive mentality, and the unsatisfactory results further compounded my pessimism. What resulted was a negative feedback loop that spiraled out of control. The root cause was not external conditions, but my mentality itself. The old saying is that 10% of life is what happens to you. The other 90% is how you respond. I responded inadequately, and I used mental health as an excuse. Instead of shifting my outlook and focusing on the positive, I constantly thought about the negative, and I evidently paid the price for it. Fundamentally, I have realized that it was necessary for me to be humbled like that. I certainly wouldn't have become as mentally strong and learned valuable lessons without that experience. This experience has cemented in my mind that there is a purpose to the pain. So, what can we learn from this? Just as I have uncovered, focusing on mental health is crucial. If you aren't feeling well, and the situation has gone beyond your ability to cope, reach out to others. You shouldn't suffer alone and in silence, especially since calling upon others can reveal a solution that you initially failed to realize, in addition to providing much needed support. With all that said, much of what we grapple with is due to our own decisions. We all face stress, feel anxious, and go through rough patches. However, our perspective can either alleviate the circumstances or it can exacerbate it. If you frequently focus on the negative, then all you'll see and experience are detrimental elements. During my rough patch, all I focused on was the negative. I refused to see that I was still very fortunate and blessed. For example, I had a roof over my head. I was attending a very prestigious school and working towards a brighter future. I was surrounded by family who cared about me. I had a good job. I was attending a very vibrant church community, and I had friends I could talk to. In other words, I had so much to be grateful for, but I took it for granted. The mind plays great tricks on us, but that doesn't mean that we can't see through the illusions. Maintaining proper mental health is important, but when it begins to falter, we cannot let it become an excuse. Whenever I feel sad or ungrateful these days, I tend to ask myself, if others can remain content and happy through worse hardships, then why can't you? If they can focus on the bright side and count their blessings, then why can't you? I usually smarten up after I ask those questions, because I realize that I'm using mental health as an excuse. For the most part, you're in charge of your mind. You have control over your mentality and how you perceive circumstances. While there are genuinely arduous conditions that evidently impact our mental health, like losing a loved one, we can't let it get to us. We have to keep moving forward regardless. In day-to-day matters, whether that's working on assignments, performing tasks at work, managing interpersonal relationships, or figuring out how we're going to balance our finances, we must find a way to succeed. We'll encounter resistance because there will be stress and anxiety that questions our ability to succeed, but that's part of the process. These ventures are difficult and we wouldn't worry about them if they were easy. Nonetheless, like other obstacles, the formula is the same. They initially appear daunting and our minds will find all sorts of excuses to avoid conquering them. However, once we muster up the courage to try and keep grinding away, we'll find that once we have begun, it wasn't as bad as we initially thought. When you overcome those obstacles, you can reflect on how arduous it initially appeared, but realize now that your mind exacerbated it. Possessing the courage to face challenges in spite of apprehensions is true bravery. Bravery doesn't imply the absence of fear, but rather, persisting irrespective of that fear. The British Special Air Service has a particularly fitting motto. It remarks, quote, "Who dares wins," end quote. Indeed, to succeed in any pursuit, you must gather the courage to dare. Whoever dares to make the attempt, regardless of whether they succeed or fail, is denoted as better than those who never try. Why? Because although success isn't guaranteed, it certainly will never happen if you refuse to make any effort. So, dare to win, and find the courage to face obstacles, including yourself. Take care of your mental health, but at the same time don't let the focus surrounding it become an excuse, especially during ostensibly expedient moments. It can and will become a hindrance if you aren't careful. Finally, if you're losing control of your mind, then find a way to retake the wheel. Sometimes it takes months, like in my case. On other occasions, it takes years. However long it takes, though, you must refuse to quit because eventually circumstances will improve. Eventually the pain will subside, even if you can't envision that possibility at this very moment in time.